want to introduce the folks who will be speaking today. First, we're going to be hearing a little bit from Alexandra Sirota, who is the executive director here at the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center. And then we're going to get an update about some court cases going on right now around the amendments to the state constitution from Kat Robles, who is with a senior voting rights counsel and litigation manager from Ford Justice. And then at the end, Danny Hoffpower and I will be talking a little bit about some stuff that you can do to take action about what you're hearing today. So with that, I am going to turn it over to, well, Alexandra in a moment here. This is just another slide about some of the agenda items that we're going to be doing. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alexandra for some tax policy updates.
Great, thanks. It's great to be with you all. Very excited to talk to you about tax policy. It's something that we follow at the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center with an eye to the power that these policy choices have to make lives better. If you go to the next slide, we really do see taxes as a way that we come together to fund the services over time in a way that keeps up with the cost of delivering those services and the priorities that people have for services in their communities. By creating a tax code that is equitable and adequate, we can make sure that we achieve greater equity in the outcomes we see in our communities. And we primarily can do that by making sure that wealthy and corporations pay what they owe. So taxes matter to our goals for a better North Carolina and a better future. Income taxes in particular are incredibly important to the state's ability to fund the future that we all want to see for our families, our neighbors, our communities. You can see from this graph that from state revenue, more than half comes from income taxes. The combination of income taxes from individuals and corporations is a significant source of public money that we can use to fund public goods and people's priorities. Next slide. But North Carolina has been on a dangerous path to eliminating income taxes in the state for more than a decade. Since 2011, the idea of moving towards zero income tax has been a prominent part of the policy debate in every budget cycle. And as you can see from this graph, when we look at what's happened with the corporate income tax, in many years, we've seen the corporate income tax rate reduced. And eventually, after 2030, the corporate income tax in North Carolina will be zero. This is a problem both for adequacy, the ability of our state to fund the public services that make opportunity more widely available. And it's a problem for equity in that it makes our tax code more reliant on revenue sources that ask more from people with low and middle incomes, such as the sales tax. Next slide. So one of the things that we just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of is that we're on this path because of decisions made in prior years and because there was no action taken by the General Assembly in this session to stop the income tax rate reductions. In January 2025, the corporate income tax rate will drop again down to 2.25%, and the personal income tax rate will drop again to 4.25%. The result of these reductions in rates will be a total loss to our public money of $1.4 billion each year. We know that since 2013, 2/3 of the tax cuts that have been granted through this income tax reduction plan has gone to the richest 20% of North Carolinians. So I'll say that again because it is a big number. 2/3 of the tax cuts that have happened over the past decade have gone to the richest 20% of North Carolinians. So what we're seeing here is that North Carolina continues on this path to deliver significant tax cuts for profitable corporations and the wealthy, even as our public schools, our public health programs, our housing all needs a significant attention from with our public money. Next slide. So within this context, unfortunately, we've seen an even more damaging proposal emerge. For those of you that have followed budget and tax policy for years, you'll recognize this idea of a limit placed on budget spending or a limit placed on the tax rate that is allowed. And this idea emerged again in the past legislative session in the last few weeks of June. And just want to say together as a community of advocates, concerned citizens, folks across the state and community, we worked together to stop this proposal from moving to the ballot this November for now. But it is an important topic, and as you'll hear, one that we need to continue to stay engaged in. The idea of this is that, and the bill in particular that did not pass was Senate Bill 630. This bill would have lowered the maximum income tax rate allowed to 5% in the state constitution. Again, this did not pass, but it's worth going deeper, I think, into why this is such a problem for our state, because as the income tax cuts that are happening are increasingly unpopular, we expect to see more and more efforts to lock in this dangerous path through things like changes to our state constitution. Next slide. Before we go too far, though, I do want to just ground us in where these ideas come from. Again, they're motivated by an idea of who should and who should not pay taxes, what should our public money go to. In North Carolina, they're particularly tied to the path to zero income tax that we're on and an interest to keep that in place. But they're also connected to a longer history that has very racist origins of tax and spending limits. The first emergence of tax and spending limits were in Southern state constitutions after Reconstruction ended. And the goal was to limit the taxes paid by wealthy white landowners and limit the public money that was available to invest in broader economic opportunity. So I think it's really important that we connect with this history and bring it forward to today as we examine the impact of proposed tax and spending limits. Next slide. So I'm going to speak at very high level. We have a fact sheet that we hope you'll dig in on and share around with your networks. But there are really three impacts of a tax cap in the state constitution. The first is that it limits the ability of future lawmakers to ensure the wealthy and profitable corporations pay what they owe. By capping the income tax at a lower rate, it is more difficult to create a graduated income tax rate. It's more difficult to raise the rate higher on income over a certain threshold. So that's one challenge. The second challenge is it locks in the power of current legislators and their ideas about what tax policy should be and blocks future voters from expressing their will. So by putting in place the Constitution now that locks in this low rate, future lawmakers will have limited tools available to them to fund things that future voters want to see funded in their community. The third impact is that it shifts the tax load onto the majority of North Carolinians and raises costs. The reason that it shifts the tax load onto the majority of North Carolinians is that it limits the income tax, and so future policymakers look to the sales tax, look to fines, fees as a way to make up for lost revenue, or they push the cost to North Carolinians in the form of reduced public services. And so issues like less affordable childcare go unaddressed in communities across the state. There's another aspect of the tax cap that I think it's important to note around cost, which is we know that rating agencies that look at the ability of Carolina as a state to pay its debts look poorly on limits on tax and spending. And so when these are in place, the cost, sorry, my dog is barking, I don't know if you can hear that. The cost of borrowing for important investments that we need is limited. Next slide. Sorry, you might not be able to hear me. Is that true? Should I go back?
It's still very low. Do you want to try again?
Sorry.
That works.
So the last point was just around the costs of the tax cap to which one of those costs that we don't often hear about, but which is important, is that with tax and spending limits, the cost of borrowing can increase. Rating agencies that look at the ability of states to pay back debt that they've taken often look at whether a state has limits on its ability to raise the revenue needed to fund priorities. So that's an important cost that happens as a result of putting in place a lower maximum tax rate in the state constitution. I think one thing I'll close with saying is that the other broader issue around an income tax cap for North Carolina is that the 5% income tax maximum that was proposed, for example, this past session, is largely unnecessary. North Carolina's income tax rates are well below 5% right now, so it provides no tax cut at the current moment. And as I mentioned, the state policymakers already have the ability through legislation to pursue tax policies that they believe are best for the state. The change to the state constitution then becomes largely an exercise in limiting the ability of future voters to express their will, of future policymakers to meet the needs of the communities, and to make sure that the wealthy and profitable corporations pay what they owe. With that, I'll turn it over to Kat.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kat Robles, and I am Senior Voting Rights Counsel and Litigation Manager at Forward Justice. And we represent the NAACP in a case challenging 2 constitutional amendments from 2018, one of those being a tax cap. So I know Alexandra just gave all the framing, which was so helpful, of sort of where this all came from, because I think this goal of the legislature to cap the maximum allowable tax rate for the state has obviously been going on for a while. And this is a part of that story. To go back just a little bit to where this all started, because a lot of this case is really about how they passed these constitutional amendments. In 2011, we had new maps drawn by the General Assembly. They were redesigning the state's electoral maps using racial gerrymandering. They did a statewide redistricting from the 2010 maps, and that resulted in a lot of litigation. And that, racially gerrymandered General Assembly, through this litigation that came about, a lot of you might have heard about the Covington case. That final decision came down in 2017, confirming that our legislature, those 2010 maps, were racially gerrymandered. And specifically, they found that 28 legislative districts violated the Equal Protection Clause. So it is not just a small portion of the legislature. This affected a large portion of the legislature. And the reason I give this background is because this all led up to the proposal to amend the North Carolina Constitution in 2018. So essentially, once the North Carolina legislature was already on notice that 28 of its districts were racially gerrymandered, they went ahead and proposed to offer 6 amendments to the North Carolina Constitution all at once in 2018, which is certainly unprecedented. And one of those was a photo voter ID amendment, and one of those was a tax cap. And in order to pass a constitutional amendment, the bar is high. They have to do 2 things. They have to get 3/5 of the legislature to vote for it, not just a simple majority. And they have to get a majority of the electorate to vote for it. So in this case, they were able to get their 3/5 majority by pulling from racially gerrymandered districts, people who already knew because of the Covington decision that they were probably going to be losing that supermajority in 2018. So they used their racial gerrymander to get their 3/5. I apologize. And then they brought these to the voters. So if any of you all were here living in North Carolina voting in 2018, you may remember that you had to vote on these 6 constitutional amendments. The tax cap amendment, what they were asking for was to lower the maximum allowable state income tax rate from 10% to 7%. And obviously the reason that they wanted to do this as a constitutional amendment is because it is much harder to undo. It is not something they can get a simple majority and change with regular legislation. Once something is in the Constitution, it needs to be changed again with another constitutional amendment, meaning they would need their 3/5 majority. So they brought these to the voters. In this case, 57% of voters approved the tax cap amendment in the 2018 elections. And so the North Carolina NAACP filed a lawsuit arguing that they did not have the legal right to amend the Constitution when they were already on notice that so many of their districts and the districts they needed in order to actually amend the Constitution were racially gerrymandered. Essentially, they had no right to actually do this because they were not rightfully in office in the first place. So we brought that lawsuit challenging 2 constitutional amendments, the tax cap and the photo voter ID amendment. That's the NAACP v. Moore case. And so there's a lot of back and forth, which I won't go through all of the litigation back and forth, but the key issue here was whether legislators that are elected from racially gerrymandered districts essentially have unlimited authority to change the Constitution, including in this case, ways that would allow them to entrench their own power and to make it harder for changes to be made later. And ultimately, this case came before a single judge in Wake County, Judge Brian Collins. He ruled for the plaintiffs in this case. We went up to the Court of Appeals. We lost to the Court of Appeals 2-1, and then went up to the North Carolina Supreme Court. And ultimately in 2022, we got a decision from the North Carolina Supreme Court written by Justice Anita Earls, saying that there is a limit to what a racially gerrymandered legislature can do. The North Carolina Supreme Court in 2022 ordered that while a racially gerrymandered legislature may continue to engage in ordinary acts like passing regular legislation, they don't have unlimited power to amend the state constitution. However, because of the way this case proceeded and that there wasn't really a discovery period getting into the details of the tax cap and the photo voter ID amendment, this case was set back. It was remanded by the North Carolina Supreme Court. What they said was that there's not unlimited power to amend the Constitution, but that it needed to be sent back to answer some more factual questions that the trial court needed to figure out. This three-part test that they created. The first part is whether the challenged amendment would immunize legislators elected due to unconstitutional racial gerrymandering from Democratic accountability going forward. The second part is whether this amendment would perpetuate the continued exclusion of a category of voters from the democratic process. And the third is whether this amendment would constitute intentional discrimination against the same category of voters discriminated against in the reapportionment process. And so, like I said, we're challenging two different amendments here, photo voter ID and tax cap. So that means each of those will be assessed by the trial court separately, whether or not they will meet this test. And I do want to make sure to say that our position as the plaintiffs in this case is that after the 2022 decision from the Supreme Court, from Anita Earls, that these amendments right now are currently void. I understand obviously right now our tax rate is not near that 7% cap as it stands, but just that's our position, is that both of these amendments are currently void unless and until we get a new decision from the North Carolina, from the Superior Court. So right now we are going through a fact-finding phase. We need to, bring to the court our evidence that we think both of these amendments meet the test set out by the North Carolina Supreme Court in 2022. The case was initially sent back to Judge Shirley. However, there was a motion made by the defense to transfer it to a 3-judge panel on the argument that it was a facial challenge to the Constitution. We as the plaintiffs oppose that, but ultimately this case has been sent to a 3-judge panel. It's going to be in front of Superior Court judges Gregory Bell, Michael Duncan, and Cynthia Sturgis. So they have taken over this case, and we will be bringing our case to them to argue that these amendments do meet the test and that they should continue to be void. So this is clearly going to be an ongoing fight. And what I will say is that thus far, a lot of this case has been about the process by which these amendments were passed, but that this next phase of the case, in terms of meeting that test, is going to be a lot more about the content of these amendments, what the impact of the tax cap is, what the impact is of the photo voter ID requirement. So I think in this next phase, there will certainly be a lot more engagement and fact-finding into the tax cap part of this, going along with a lot of what Alexandra talked about in terms of the goal that the legislators had to cap the maximum allowable rate, and how this constitutional amendment in 2018 fit into that. So that is where we're at right now. We are still fighting this. We are before our 3-judge panel, trying to move forward with discovery and ultimately having some type of evidentiary hearing or trial in this case in the Wake County Superior Court.
All right, thank you very much, Kat. And I just wanted to let everybody know that a lot of these resources and further information will be included in an email that we'll be sending out after this presentation. So with that, I would like to open up the floor to questions. You can raise your hand, you can put your question in the chat, and I can read it out loud and let me know who has a question for us. Looks like we have one. Mark says, on the reduction of income tax to corporations, is that for all businesses, CS, LLC, etc., or just the largest of the corporations like Amazon, Bank of America, etc.?
I can take that one. It's a great question. The corporate income tax, as you likely know, since you've listed the different types of businesses, only applies to the profits of certain businesses that are organized as C Corp and some S Corp, but primarily the businesses that pay this are very highly profitable. So more than 74% of the corporate income taxes collected in North Carolina come from corporations with more than $25 million in profit who have a majority of their business outside of North Carolina. So these are larger multi-state corporations that are paying the corporate income tax. The corporate income tax does not impact most businesses in North Carolina. Most businesses in North Carolina and across the country are organized as LLCs and not subject to the corporate income tax. They actually pay taxes primarily through the personal income tax and then other. So it's a really important question. The corporate income tax is a critical way for us to ensure that corporations that are highly profitable and operating in our state, as well as multiple states, are contributing to here locally to our communities.
Thank you, Alexandra. We have a question from Christopher. Does the original plaintiff, NAACP, in the 2018 North Carolina constitutional case retain its status in the current process to go to the Superior Court 3-judge panel?
Yes, we are still the plaintiff in the case. Essentially, it just went all the way up through the court system, Superior Court, Court of Appeals, then to the North Carolina Supreme Court, but it got remanded for further fact finding. So we are still the plaintiff. We just have a new set of judges because of the back and forth about whether this is a facial challenge to these constitutional amendments or an as-applied challenge. Ultimately, the ruling was that it was a facial challenge, and all facial challenges in North Carolina get sent to a 3-judge panel of the Wake County Superior Court.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Mark comments, thank you. So it truly is an equity issue for North Carolina. Okay, we'll get that resolved. Okay, are there, yes, somebody says they can hear, Katerina says she can hear. Okay, are there any other questions for either of our panelists before we move on to what we can do next? Okay, well, if there are any questions that come up, please feel free to email us at info@ncbudget.org. And I'll put that in the chat in a second here. But what we're going to do now is I'm going to turn it over and share my screen to Danny Hoffpower, who is our community building manager. You can correct me on that if I got it wrong, but and to talk to us a little bit about some next steps that you can take.
Thanks, Mel. It was close enough. It's community building and program manager. It's long, it's a mouthful. Hey y'all, thanks for joining us, and thanks to our speakers for giving us that in-depth look. So we never want to leave a space without knowing what we can do about the situation, right? And there is a lot that we can do. And one of the biggest things right now that we are really pushing is our petition. So we're going to do an action together right now, really easy. And I believe I saw some very familiar names of the people that are joining us today, some of the participants. So y'all might already have been wrangled into doing this. But bear with me if you have. So I'm going to get y'all to scan that QR code. So for folks that maybe aren't tech savvy, no big deal. I'm not either. I'm going to explain really quickly how to do this, or you can just go to this ncbudget.org/choose communities. You can just type that into your browser and it'll come up. Or if you want to give it a shot, you can open up your camera on your phone and you'll hold your phone up to the screen and on this little weird looking pixelated thing. And then a link will come up. This is ncbudget.org in yellow. You'll click on that and it'll bring you directly to the petition. So once you do that, we ask that you go in there and sign that petition, letting our legislators know, our lawmakers know, we want them to choose communities over corporations, period. And if you have done that and you want more things to do, or even if you don't want more things to do, I'm still going to ask you to share this petition, the QR code, the link, whatever you find easiest to share, with 5 friends. And you can do this via text right now or through social media. So you can either share a status on your Facebook page or your Instagram story, or just inbox 5 people on your social media platforms. So we're either going to text or inbox and let them know, hey, I don't know if you've heard, but NC lawmakers have voted to eliminate this corporate income tax, and it'll happen by 2030. And we're going to lose $2 billion annually to funding things like public schools and our roads and other really basic needs that we need in our day-to-day lives. So just letting them know what they're going to lose, how it affects us directly, and letting them know that if they signed on and shared with other people, it would mean a whole lot to you. So I hope that you're doing that right now. I wish I could see y'all. And like I said, if you're not tech savvy, definitely just enter in that ncbudget.org/choose communities and share it with 5 people. That's what I'm leaving you with. Sign it yourself, share it with 5 people. We hope that this information gets out to the broader scope of folks, because a lot of people don't know it's happening. So, and like Mel has said multiple times, we'll be sharing all of this information in a follow-up email with more reading material and direct links and videos. And I'll pass it to Mel.
Thank you, Danny. So now we're gonna just give you a few details about another action hour that you can join. And this is also going to be in the email that we're sending out. So feel free to just listen, and you don't have to take a lot of notes. But next Friday, we're going to be doing an action hour with the Reverend Lisa, who has been doing an action hour every Friday for forever. And so we'll send some details out about that. And we're going to be sharing some about how you can get more involved, including sharing this continuing to share this petition, because we're trying to get so many signatures on it. And we'll be doing some stuff around the American Rescue Plan and having you connect with your local electeds. We'll have an email you can send then, and we'll be doing some other stuff during the action hour. So we'll be sending out some details about how you can join that as well next Friday. And so with that, I just want to thank you all for coming and for continuing to be a part of this fight and to care about these issues that affect so many people in our community. And with that, I'll give you, a few more minutes on your lunch break, hopefully, to go take care of whatever you need to take care of. Thanks again, y'all. Bye.